Hi, I'm Dr. Bernard Starr. Today I'm going to talk to you about one of our national pastimes, watching political polls. Are we spending our time wisely? Can they be trusted? If not, what's wrong with them? That's the subject of my article that was published in Op-Ed News on October 26th. Listen now to my expanded version. What the media doesn't want to know or report about political polls, but should know and report. Americans increasingly don't trust political polls, mostly because these surveys are so often wrong. Remember 2016 and all those predictions about Hillary being ahead and a sure winner? But there is a more important reason why polls shouldn't be trusted. They rarely meet scientific standards. And they should, if we are to take them seriously. Yes, sometimes a bad poll can pick the winner. So can pulling one name of the two candidates out of a hat. With one pick, you have a 50-50 chance of being correct. If this picking the winner technique was to pull one of the two names out of a hat 10 times, it might pick Joe Biden's name out 8 times. In other words, one set of 10 picks can deviate from the 50-50 probability. If Biden then won by a large margin, would that validate the pick-em-out-of-the-hat method of polling? No, of course not. It would be foolish to endorse this method based on a successful prediction. To inform serious discussion during an ongoing political race, it's essential to have trusted polls that stand on sound scientific principles. As director of a graduate program at the City University of New York Brooklyn College, I taught research methods in statistics. The first thing I want to see in a report on a poll or survey, or any research, is the methodology. How many people participated in the poll? What was the makeup of the sample? For example, age, sex, education, political affiliation, residence, and more. In other words, I want to know how well the sample represents the population under study as a whole. Why these factors first? They comprise the first link in the chain leading to the results. If the first link is broken or markedly deficient, why look further at findings that lack scientific credibility? News anchors like to pretend that all polls and studies are valid, so they can bring out their panels each time there is a change, even a slight change, in the polling numbers. It's their job to fill airtime and keep their viewers watching. They couldn't do that with some of these polls if they began by evaluating the methodology and concluded that a poll result was questionable or even worthless. Let's look at an example. On October 5th, the New York Times reported that the New York Times Siena College poll in Pennsylvania showed Biden ahead by 7%, 42% to 49%. An impressive lead. The only details in this report were that 706 likely voters were polled with a sampling error of 4.1 percentage points. This bare-bones media reporting is typical for almost all political polls. The 4.1% margin of error in the Times Siena poll suggests that the actual gap between Biden and Trump could be smaller than 7%. But still a significant lead for Biden. However, the sample size of 706 likely voters is woefully inadequate for assessing the Pennsylvania population of 12.8 million with over 8 million registered voters. It is highly unlikely, if not impossible, for a sample of 706 likely voters to represent the diversity in the Pennsylvania population equivalent to their representation in the general population of Pennsylvania voters. All those factors I just cited. Yet small, non-representative samples, even less than 706, are typical of political polls. Like most political polls, the Times Siena poll was conducted over the telephone. Unfortunately, the response rate to telephone queries is in free fall, down to as little as 6% according to the most recent report by the Pew Research Center. We don't know how many thousands were called to get the 706 responses in the Times Siena poll, Undoubtedly, many thousands of those called obviously didn't answer or refused to participate. How many? That's never reported. Why is that figure important? Pollsters like to say they are choosing subjects using the respected method of random sampling to avoid bias, like picking every 20th name in a telephone directory. Well, good intention, but most who were called refused to participate. So rather than the pollsters picking a random sample, the small number that responds is picking the pollsters. Are the ones who are willing to cooperate representative of the entire population? Probably not. As the Pew Research Center puts it, quote, "The key to survey research is to have a random sample so that every person has an equal chance of having their views captured. Polls of volunteers would violate this principle. The kinds of people who might volunteer for our polls are likely to be very different from the average American," end quote. Yet the small numbers who agreed to be interviewed in almost every poll are, in effect, volunteers. The way pollsters address the paucity of representation of diversity in sampling is by weighting. Simply stated, weighting is a statistical technique of compensating for inadequate sampling by assigning a mathematical number, that is, giving greater weight to the underrepresented number of participants in a category. Each weighting degrades the poll as expressed in the margin of error, also sometimes called error of measurement. The greater the margin of error, the less likely the accuracy of reported results. That's why it's important to know specifically how many factors are weighted, but that too is rarely if ever reported by the media. In the case of the Times Siena poll, I had to go to the site of the organization that conducted the poll to find out, the Siena College Research Institute. There I learned that virtually every component in the skimpy sample of 706 respondents was deficient and therefore had to be weighted. Quote, "The data was weighted by party, age, race, ethnicity, education, region, gender, and voter likelihood," end quote. This is not surprising. It was tipped off by the small 706 sample size. An analogy will explain weighting and why it degrades the validity of polls. There is a story of a Russian peasant couple who splurge with the few rubles they recently acquired. They decide to treat themselves to a few potatoes and are excited at the prospect of eating potato pancakes just like the rich people. They prepare the potatoes, but when it comes to adding the other ingredients, they realize they don't have them. So what do? They use substitutes. Don't have the proper oil? No problem. Replace it with a different ingredient. Don't have the required spices? No problem. Replace them with substitutes, or leave them out. When the pancakes are ready, the couple sits down at the kitchen table. They excitedly bite into the pancakes. After swallowing a few pieces, they cringe with disgust and look at each other in astonishment. Why on earth do rich people like to eat potato pancakes, they ask each other. Translate that story into preparing political polls, or cooking them. You don't have enough African Americans in the sample compared to their representation in the general population you are polling? No problem. Just replace that omission with a number using a mathematical formula. Too few millennials? No problem. Boost their representation with a number. Not enough elderly? Just assign a number to compensate. The underlying assumption is that these mathematical weightings are equivalent to actually polling more human subjects equal to their percentage in the overall population being polled. Is that assumption valid? We can't be sure. The researchers believe that assigning greater values to small numbers of participants in underrepresented samples, weighting, is almost as good as polling more human subjects. This enables them to announce the, quote, validity of their findings. But depending on the number of weightings, what they may be offering for public consumption is the Russian peasant potato pancakes. Bon appetit! Okay, that's my report, but I'll add this note. While we can't trust the findings of a poll with a small non-representative sample, if there are a large number of such polls, collectively they may represent a significant segment of the population being studied. Currently, a plethora of individually flawed polls due to small samples all give Joe Biden a wide margin over Trump. Thus, it's reasonable to speculate that Biden probably does have the lead. Keep in mind, though, that most often there are only singular or a small number of polls for local elections and polls and surveys on other topics, for example, how many preferred this or that. If the sampling in these polls is inadequate, we can only reject or remain skeptical about the reported results. So how can polls be made more trustworthy? Simple. Follow the scientific principles for rendering them valid and reliable. Gather large enough samples that include all of the diverse groups in a population and have enough of each group that is near equivalent to their representation in the population. Don't use weightings, use human subjects, or use only limited weightings. Let's face it, though, the polling organizations know how to do it right. But to do polls right requires substantial planning and sufficient time to achieve truly representative samples. They certainly can't be quickies done overnight. And to do them right means fewer polls that will cost more and will cut into the profits for rolling out results. To produce valid and reliable polls, therefore, means replacing the fast buck with science. Thanks for listening. I'm Dr. Bernard Starr.